circumstances. I can see the chat box, so feel free to type. I'll keep an eye on it, and can happy to take questions as you go typing. I see at least one person is not hearing well. If anyone does hear me well, then that'll know it's not on my side. So just type if you can hear okay, just to confirm, anybody who can, because one person in Kigali said they could not. Super, thank you, Sarah. Excellent. Okay, very good. That's great. That's great. Yeah. So so this is work which is funded by DFID and also the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. You can see the website of the project in the middle of the screen. CANDASA is the name of the project, which stands for Changing Access to Nutritious Diets in Africa and South Asia. Our question, as you can see, is whether we can use some economic tools, some price indexes, to think about how food systems are changing. So the basic motivation is to try to understand where and when nutritious diets are within reach of households, whether foods are affordable in circumstances where they are, then household food consumption and health outcomes will depend on food choice and nutrition knowledge and other things. But where diets are out of reach, something else would have to happen first in the food environment, in the food system outside the household. That would be something in the marketplace, something with lower prices or perhaps safety nets.
Dr. Shankar here, and messages for Alfie's parent. I'm sorry, I'm not able to.
So
this is
commonplace knowledge for nutritionists. There's actually some background noise from someone, so if they could put themselves on mute, that would be great. The background that economists have, that markets are fundamental to human well-being, is not something that nutritionists always keep in mind. A well-known economist called Martin Keim has been very active kind of documenting for nutritionists just how much markets are important for consumers. So market purchases are especially important because they fill seasonal gaps, even among farm households who are growing, in this case in Ethiopia, on average, about half of all their calories, but more than half come from own production. But the purchased calories fill the gap in the off season when the own production stocks run out, and they start to rely primarily, as you can see, a majority of calories in this season from purchased foods. And most fundamentally, this is really crucial for key food groups. So what are those key food groups that the purchased foods are most important for in this Ethiopian context? Well, it's these ones. And interestingly, milk, the market is almost non-existent. So people have milk only when their own cow is actually milking, is actually lactating. So that's familiar to economists, and we're used to sort of thinking about food markets. And some of you may have seen least cost diets when you were first learning economics. You might have done this or other circumstances. So our question is, can we think about whether foods are within reach, that is affordable, in the proportions needed for health? So you go to a marketplace and there's a bunch of sort of junk food behind this vendor, there's some vegetables and so forth. What we can do in this project is take retail prices for all available items that the national statisticians have judged worth measuring, for inflation, for poverty. This is in the UN system of national accounts, so they're classified by their purpose, the COICOP classification, and typically most inflation measurement uses 50 to 200 food items, including non-alcoholic beverages. Governments typically aim to survey both rural and urban markets. They typically visit either once a day, once a week, or just once a month. And we are able to get some price data from ag market information systems where they're trying to monitor a wholesale market or an internationally traded commodity, but that would be many fewer foods. So the real virtue here is lots of foods used to measure living standards. Of course, when you measure living standards, you're adding things up by expenditure. Here, we're adding things up by their nutrient contents. And in this particular project, we're looking at 21 essential nutrients not produced in the body. There's upper and lower bounds, so it's a total of 35 constraints. And we're choosing among all the available foods, what would be the least cost foods to meet an adult woman's needs. And then we do lots of variation by individual circumstances and requirements. We also think about cost of a recommended diet over food groups. So here, instead of nutrients, just thinking about the category of food, and those are reference diets, target compositions of a starchy staple plus a leguminous grain like groundnuts plus a fruit and vegetable combination and so forth. And we use the least cost way to meet those food group quantities in the reference diet. And our comparisons are against just subsistence that would allow survival from day to day, just like a bread and water diet. A prisoner or something might be on starchy staples only. And we also compare to poverty lines and so forth and think about why are these costs the way they are and what are the consequences of them. Now, there's a long tradition of least cost diets. The difference is in our project, we compute many thousands of them, one for each time, one for each place, one for each person. In a famous paper in American Economic Review, Bob Allen, a well-known economic historian, uses least cost diets as a poverty line. We don't actually do that. But when you do think about it as a poverty line, as you'll see from our results and from Bob Allen's results, there's more people in this sense of poverty than there are in the World Bank $1.90 a day poverty line. And the fundamental reason for that is that nutrient requirements are this policy goal for long-term health. Real people, in the course of their ordinary lives, don't actually choose to buy adequate diets in terms of vitamin A, vitamin D, B12, B6, and so forth. Those are expensive nutrients. Most people don't actually get enough. You can certainly survive a long time without adequate nutrients, actually. And they're not revealed preference because people, when they choose, prefer different combinations of foods that will be more convenient and so forth than this aspirational kind of long-term health diet. Interestingly, Bob Allen also finds higher local price levels than household expenditure PPPs. So when you just think about what is the overall price level in a country, that's relatively low. The price level is low because local services are cheap in a low-income country where wages are low. But food commodities are actually really expensive. So we start with that observation. This is in some sense, our most important finding in this entire project, is that price levels for food in general, the red line here, at lower income countries are systematically higher than the total index of all household expenditure, because what's low priced in low income countries are things that are a lot of services like this. In contrast, things that require higher skill like education or food markets are relatively expensive, in part because they're traded and in part because of low productivity in producing the non-traded types of foods, such as vegetables and fruits and so forth, are just at low productivity. Dairy, eggs, all those are at low productivity compared to a high-income country. So prices are relatively high in poor countries, and that's our sort of most important finding here. Really dramatic. So our focus is food costs and affordability, thinking about the combination of foods that could be brought within reach of low-income people. Remember, national statistical agencies are collecting these food prices all the time. The International Comparison Program, as you might know, uses a selection of those items. So it's a total of 799 in the 2011 data. New data for 2017 will be released very soon. We don't know exactly how many, but something on the order of 1,000 foods and beverages around the world. Those are just the standard ones sold in multiple countries. And we can analyze how these prices relate to the wholesale or traded commodity prices that get tracked in something like this. Obviously, retail prices include a lot of retail services, as well as trade and transport handling after. And we can think a lot about those retail markups. So let's talk for a moment about nutrition and the nutrient adequate diet. That's something based on George Stigler, very famous at the time of World War II, when nutrients were first discovered, required quantities were estimated, and that was the origin of the linear programming method. The simplex algorithm of George Dantzig in the 50s solved this problem very efficiently, computationally, so we can now run many thousands of them with very simple R code, looping over every marketplace, every person, and every month of observation. But our food composition data are way better than what Stigler had in the 30s. We know a lot more about what's in food. We also know a lot more about nutrient requirements. But it's really crucial to emphasize this is an envelope method. It's a least cost diet. So you pick up all the little errors. And if there's an error that would fit in the least cost diet, for example, a food has, say, mistakenly too much selenium, it becomes a cheap source of selenium. And then that's a mistake, that's an error. And so because this is an envelope method at the extremes, it's not like a OLS estimator that's just measuring the average. We need to remember that a lot of our observations are actually outliers. Cost recommended diets uses these dietary guidelines that are in terms of food groups, so certain quantity of fruits and vegetables, certain quantity of dairy, a certain quantity of protein foods like egg or meat. And these are official government policies used to set various targets, so they're attractive for that purpose. And finally, for global reference, I'll talk a bit about an Eat Lancet diet, which is a diet that uses 15 different food groups. And it is created primarily because they wanted to separate out all the different food groups from animals so that they could ask what would happen when people reduce animal consumption and then gradually eliminate all the meat, so it's pescatarian, all the fish, so it's vegetarian, and then eliminate all the milk and eggs as well, so it's a vegan diet. And that was the primary motivation of the Eat Lancet Commission, was to separate out all the animal source foods and ask what would happen when those are reduced and then eliminated. So here's what we find in terms of the global cost of these diets. In low-income countries, costs of diets are lower in purchasing power parity terms. Now, these are purchasing power parity at overall household expenditure, which remember is different from food prices because food prices are higher in poor countries. But at overall household expenditure, PPPs, the cost is actually lower in low-income countries. That's mainly because they have more basic items within some food groups. So in the United States, for example, there's no cassava in the available. So costs are higher here because there's just no cheaper source. Whereas in low-income countries, there would be a very low-cost item in various categories. You can see that the expensive categories up here, meat and fish, those bring the total well above the World Bank poverty line. That's the idea that poverty in this sense is greater. The poverty line is higher. When you think about food, these foods are simply unaffordable for people at a World Bank poverty line. They're also unaffordable at the World Bank middle income poverty line of $3.20. 26% of the world population has lower than $3.20 a day in PPP terms, and that is unaffordable because food would take up almost all of their total household income, leaving nothing for anything else. So clearly, food is very expensive relative to these poverty lines. The total number of people that we estimate could not afford an Eat Lancet diet is 1.6 billion. It's quite a lot, and it's of course primarily in very low income countries. What's interesting from a nutritional and policy point of view is to think about, is it possible to meet needs in a less attractive way than a recommended diet? And what we find when we compare the Lancet pattern to a just minimally nutrient adequate, just going vitamin by vitamin, nutrient by nutrient, you can actually do it quite a bit less expensively. You can see in the blue everywhere in the world than just the Eat Lancet combinations, because you take away almost all the animal source foods just to get nutrients. Just tiny amounts of animal source foods are usually needed, and you have much larger volume of, say, beans and other foods that are a bit tricky to cook. People don't really like to eat them that much, but they're very low cost and have lots of nutrients. And if we compare that to the cost of just energy from starchy staples, a bread and water type diet, that would be just a big pile of maize porridge, nsima in East Africa or kenkey or whatever, like very low cost starchy staple. Those are generally quite low cost in poor countries. Poor countries have a very strong sort of orientation towards producing those. Productivity is not that low compared to higher value crops that are more tricky to grow and have supply to retail markets. So this premium that's needed, the gap between the nutrient adequate diet and just the calorie adequate diet, you can see that that's a very big jump up. And that's a big part of our focus here, is how can the investments in the nutrient adequate foods that would bring B6, B12, calcium, as well as more fats to the diet, how can those foods be made lower cost at the point of sale in rural as well as urban areas? So that multiple, the premium for nutrients over subsistence, is actually highest in Africa, in South Asia. It's also quite high, interestingly, in some rich countries that have very cheap starchy staples, actually. But in these countries, you can see that it's just a big hill to climb to get up to the higher cost, more nutritious foods. It's also very important for us to be thinking across regions of the country, across seasons, and across types of people over the life course. So this is comparing many tens of thousands of least cost diets across Malawi every month, every market location. You can see we're representing almost all the country and quite a wide span of time. And thinking about the range, so this is the interquartile range, and then 1.5 times the interquartile range is the box and whiskers, plus the outlier extremes are all shown here. I've cut off a few outlier extremes up here, but what you see is the males have higher cost of meeting overall diets up above the poverty lines here. These poverty lines, by the way, are the Malawi one and the US one, the global one of $1.90. As size and physical activity grows, but what's really expensive are the needs of women, especially during pregnancy and lactation, where in almost all market months around the country over this time period, it was much more expensive to feed a pregnant woman or a lactating woman during that period than the poverty line. So, and much more expensive to feed her nutrient adequate diet than to feed a man. Children are relatively low cost because they're very small, but if we think about the cost in terms of the quality of the diet, the cost per meal, the cost per 1,000 calories, that's about the same for all women, but it's much lower for men because they can eat just a whole bunch more starchy staples because of the higher energy needs relative to their nutrient requirements other than energy during the adult period. So which micronutrients are the scarce ones? Well, they're the expensive things. They're the micronutrients that are found in higher cost foods, including calcium from dairy or eggs and so forth, and then some nutrients that are found only in animal source foods, like B12 over here. Very important when we do these least cost diets over thousands and thousands of markets, months, and in the case of Malawi here, what we see are really interesting seasonal patterns that reflect the opportunities to invest in the food system, where, as you can imagine, storable grains, both the cereal grains and pulses like groundnuts, those have synchronized seasonal peaks. In Malawi case, around March, April, right now would be the peak price in Malawi. But for fruits and vegetables, some fruits and vegetables have a peak that's aligned with the peak cost of the starchy staples and the groundnuts, but others have very different prices. So substitution between fruits and vegetables is really important to get your vitamin A, for example, from mangoes at some time other than the peak, right? So this is the time when you can't get mangoes, and you get them from oranges and so forth at this time. And then there's some items with no seasonality. Spatial variation tells us a lot about where are hotspots of difficult market access. So in this case, this central region, DOA region, is a hotspot for lots of seasonality. Ethiopia gives us a terrific example of a long time series. We were able to get Ethiopian price data for the longest of all the countries where we've been working. They also have a nice large food list, almost 100 items. The lower food lists are like 50 items. The biggest food lists are like 300 items. But Ethiopia has a very substantial food list of 92 distinct items. And Ethiopia is also very good in that they have a lot of market locations. So this is the Central Statistical Agency, the CSA, collects these data. And what you see are really quite dramatic story of declining prices for the Green Revolution crops. So big focus on cereal grains, as you undoubtedly know, in Ethiopia. And then when we turn to these nutrient-rich foods, what we see is that during Ethiopia's boom period of growing quickly, there was this rise in the price because the supply just wasn't keeping up with increased demand during Ethiopia's income growth, eggs just rising, and also these dramatic differences in seasonality that tell us very clearly how the price dynamics for these different food groups, they're just very different market structures. They have different vendors from different regions of the country, different scales of production. And so we really need to tailor our food system policies, our agricultural interventions, our infrastructure and market development to each specific kind of food. The technologies to produce and distribute low-cost dairy are very different from producing and distributing low-cost eggs, very different from the vegetable sector. And so making sure that the agricultural development strategy targets the specific needs of dairy, eggs, and so forth is really crucial. We can see the differences so strikingly in these price patterns. It's not true that there's just one price of food. A food CPI is a very misleading thing if we want to meet people's diverse needs at least cost. So we have a new view of food system change here. We have a different way of thinking about food systems. The headline, the most important fact, is simply that a healthy diet is just too expensive for a very large number of the world's poorest. Poor food prices in general are high in poor countries relative to earnings and the cost of non-food services, partly because these are tradable commodities in many cases, or the inputs are tradable commodities. And so there's a law of one price and richer countries bid up the price, but also because a lot of it is non-traded services like for eggs or milk. Those are local and local markets with little international trade, crucially dependent on local productivity for their price. So because prices are high, the first step to eliminate undernutrition is very clearly income and safety nets. Because without that, there's very little prospect of food system change happening fast enough to lower prices enough. But once we do focus our agricultural system on these high value, high nutrient dense foods with each specific kind of nutrient or each specific food group, we know we can lower prices because other countries have achieved much lower prices for these specific foods. We can compare best practices and so forth. The recommended diets that are, quote, healthy and desirable all cost more than nutrient adequacy. So we do want to recognize that those are clearly desired things. And it's very important to see this distinction between just nutrient adequacy, which involves a lot of beans and ground nuts and other foods that are less tasty, less desirable than a recommended diet from a dietary guideline or the Lancet diet. And we can use these once we've automated, got some software tools to compute these linear programs very, very quickly over large numbers of markets. And we can begin to understand markets in a very powerful way. That we've been really doing a lot of research about households, a lot of research about international trade, but we haven't been studying local rural or urban marketplaces, the number of vendors, what are their markups, those sorts of questions. We can study markets in a really dramatic way now. Retail prices about what happens at the marketplace, those are collected for monitoring inflation and so forth, and they're quite confidential in many countries. In the United States, it's one of the most closely held secrets is exactly which product is measured at what place. Because anybody who could forecast U.S. inflation would, have a big edge in financial markets. So it's very secret in the U.S. Other countries are a little more open about their food price collection. and do reveal these prices on agreement, such as the agreements that we've secured to present the data I've shown you today, or through the International Comparison Program at the World Bank with that selection of foods. Just to give you the flavor of this, we're now working as much as we can with Ghana to help the Ghana Statistical Service, so individuals from the GSS represented here, and the Ministry of Food and Agriculture, especially this gentleman, John Norty, who's been the real leader in Ghana and trying to, from the government side, trying to use these data to improve nutrition. And our collaborator is the Dean of the College of Agriculture, Daniel Sarpong, here. And I should emphasize our work at Tufts is really, the nutrition side is led by Anna Herforth here, who is bringing all the sort of nutritional nuance to our work. So there's lots of questions. We are thinking hard about how monthly market prices that are collected and reported often very few days after the end of the month can be used to monitor COVID-19 disruption. So in particular, thinking about, can we find the price spikes for individual foods that could signal a supply chain failure because of a labor scarcity at a warehouse, or labor scarcity at, say, for example, harvest labor is often large groups of workers coming together to do a harvest. And so there could be labor shortage at harvest time or at packing plants and so forth. There could easily be epidemic related labor shortages that cause a supply chain failure at one of those crucial points in a supply chain for a given type of commodity, a food group. We're very interested in price collapse, especially for perishables, as people switch. Because of COVID-19, people are switching to more non-perishable food at home. So the grocery stores are selling, lots of canned goods, frozen goods, and so forth. But if you are selling fresh fish now, if you're selling fresh vegetables, we are likely to see some price collapses because people will be shopping less often. We expect to see price trends. So because income is dropping so dramatically for so many people around the world, we expect people to be switching from the preferred fancier foods to less fancy foods, inferior foods, in a sense of a demand system. And so we expect to see some pretty sharp changes back towards the more basic staples and away from preferred foods that are the terrible consequence of this massive loss of income from COVID-19 around the world. We also expect to see perhaps some spatial patterns. So if we can look for the geographic hotspots, a part of the country, like I showed you in the Malawi case, where prices would be spiking up for some geographic specific reason, like local shortages of labor in their market and distribution system, could be a terrible thing for a specific place. We'd be seeing this on a monthly basis because prices are reported that fast. If one wanted to step up the speed of monitoring, that might be possible, but quite expensive. To the extent that confidentiality is needed, we can use price indexes to mask individual item prices. I haven't shown you any individual item prices in this seminar because those are generally held confidentially, but the price indexes can be revealed. And there are some agencies that are currently doing something like this. So the World Food Program has a market monitor that reports every month the overall food CPIs of various countries, as well as a few staple foods that the World Food Program is interested in, their basic food basket. And FAO also reports monthly CPIs. There's an interesting question in the chat box asking whether price reporting is going to continue for countries that are locked down. I have no idea. That is a great question. Most food system workers are classified as essential, and so most countries that have done lockdowns have announced that they do want their markets to remain open. Of course they do, and so they designate that food traders can and should show up for work. But of course, if a given market has an epidemic, it's not clear that the vendors would go, and it's also not clear that the government officials would go. And there's a very good comment about the trends in fresh foods versus packaged and packaged and non-perishable foods, and very much concern, person writes, that food flows can be maintained over time, and it would be very likely that if we did have some sort of monitoring system like this, we would find cases where markets were not able to keep functioning. In the long run, we hope, we believe that the epidemic will pass, that it'll become a more conventional type of disease that needs surveillance and control, and not simultaneous outbreaks everywhere at once, which is the crisis here. But the food system long-term performance is very, very important for health because of immune function and chronic disease prevention. And what we're going to have from the ICP is these 2017 data coming out in a month or so that allow us to check for changes in diet cost affordability. As you recall, 2011 was a food crisis year with high world food prices for commodities. 2017, relatively low commodity price year. But remember, these are retail prices, and retail prices are very far from the wholesale commodities that are the subject of most food price monitoring. Bulk rice, bulk maize, even bulk sugar, or even bulk powdered milk are very different things from the retail prices of, say, liquid milk and so forth. Our analysis, we believe, can show a lot within each country, inform that country's government about the seasonal and year-to-year trends and the spatial patterns, the rural-urban differences, as well as geographic differences within rural areas, for infrastructure, for market institutions, to address the scarcity problem in the places where poor people live. We've been working a lot with the FAO, the World Food Program, UNICEF, and the other organizations that are part of the UN system's State of Food Insecurity. It used to be called State of Food Insecurity, SOFI. Acronym is still SOFI, but it's now stands for State of Food Security and Nutrition, because the UN system agencies in this annual flagship publication about world food are really interested in nutrition. So the theme this year is cost and affordability using our Candasa project results. That'll be published in June, we hope, with a public launch at UN's in New York. But in any case, it is the flagship document of the UN food-related agencies about the state of food in the world. And our results, the results you've just seen here, will be featured in the SOFI 2020, and they clearly reflect the importance of this economics approach, where we're thinking about how consumers can substitute among all food groups. We're thinking about how those relatively expensive, healthier food groups that are needed in a healthy diet are just out of reach without income growth or safety nets. That's the beginning point, is income growth and safety nets. And then after that, food choice, where the relative prices of different foods, definitely sensitive to retail markups, but also sensitive to the cost of the underlying commodity. So we've been doing some simulations about trade policy change, the extent to which countries are protecting particularly fruit and vegetable sectors, dairy, eggs. Their protection to those often large-scale incumbent farmers in those sectors is very costly to consumers, as we'll show in the SOFI 2020. Farm productivity is very important. We can simulate how dairy sector growth, poultry sector growth, other improvements in productivity could matter. And of course, transport costs make a big difference. So this is a work with a lot of collaborators, as I mentioned, funded by DFID, with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. A lot of the results I've shared have come from 2 doctoral students with me. And this all originates with a DFID initiative called IMANA, called Innovative Methods and Metrics for Ag Nutrition Action. So this is one of the methods and metrics that this IMANA project spawned. So Candasa is a follow-on project to this IMANA grant that was called IANDA. Our work also leverages another Gates funded project called ARENA, which is at IFPRI. So some of the results I've shared come from Kale Hirvonen, who's in Addis Ababa, also another Tufts professor and another PhD student. We have collaborators in each country playing a really crucial role here, liaising with the National Statistical Agency. That's really crucial. And we've benefited from improved food composition data funded by USAID. So I really appreciate the chance to share these results with you. And there are some questions that have already come in. Terry asks, does this study consider climate change impact of different foods? And the answer is no. We're looking only here at the health and nutrition value of food. So we don't have any measurement of environmental consequences of food choice. And it would be very interesting to do price indexes that take account of externalities like carbon emissions and so forth. That would be indeed a very different thing. But here it's just, what would it cost to meet human health needs? Very interestingly, about the climate change question, it is undoubtedly true. It is really striking how the minimum cost of meeting nutrient needs is very low in resource intensity. And that's not an accident, right? So the very least cost diets, let me pop up back to the nutrient adequate diets here, or actually we can look just across these different food groups here. So a least cost nutrient adequate diet has primarily these foods. So it's mostly this and this with a little bit of this and very small amounts of these and almost no meat at all. So the least cost nutrient adequate diet is less expensive. Let me go back to this picture. The least cost nutrient adequate diet is the blue one, and that is much less expensive than the Eat Lancet flexitarian diet, precisely because it does not include the animal source foods that are, of course, more resource intensive in all resources, not just carbon emissions, but also water and other things. Another question asked is, does the study make specific recommendations about trade-offs in affordability or availability of imported versus local produce? So that's a great question. The answer is no. When we look at all these foods in the least cost diet or in the Eat Lancet diet, across all the food groups, they are always a mix of imported and locally produced things. So when you look across these food groups, for example, these food groups are crucially dependent on typically imported veterinary products and imported traded feed, internationally traded feed. Here, these are typically non-traded, locally produced, and here there's both local and traded, where trade makes a very big difference in prices. So for SOFI, as I mentioned, we are simulating the effect of trade policy and the consequences of trade restrictions by low-income countries, including Ethiopia, but not primarily Ethiopia. So as you might know, many low-income countries are becoming very protective. It used to be true that low-income countries were taxing agriculture. Now, today's low-income countries are at much higher levels of income than they used to be, and they're at levels of income where they're often beginning to tax these, to protect producers in these sectors. So the MAFAP project of the FAO stands for Monitoring Agriculture and Food in Africa. The MAFAP project has documented quite striking patterns of trade restrictions on imports that raise local prices for dairy, eggs, and many fruits and vegetables. So for my classes this week, actually teaching, students find news examples, and government of Senegal very proudly announcing a tariff on imported tomato products to protect the local tomato industry, and that of course is very costly to consumers seeking lower cost tomato products. So tomatoes are an important vegetable.
Thanks so much, Will, and Thanks for taking some of those questions that have come up on the chat. I'm conscious that some people might not be able to see the conversation bar and might just be on the phone. So I just wonder if anyone on the phone wants to come in with a question. We'll see whether that works. But if you want to come in with a phone with a question, do jump in now. Okay, perhaps not. You might be on mute, so if you do want to come in with a question, do speak up. Otherwise, thanks, Will. There's a couple more questions there on the conversation feature.
Yeah, and I'll be sure to read them. So Malcolm asks, how far is it possible to enrich basic staples with some of these key nutrients, or would that be lost through storage and cooking? And the answer is absolutely yes. There are a number of key nutrients that can cost effectively be fortified into basic staples. And our analysis does take account of the extent to which that has already happened. And diet costs in industrialized countries are definitely kept low by fortification. The term enrichment specifically refers to replacing a nutrient that was taken out. So for example, if I refine wheat flour, I've taken out some nutrients from the germ, the seed coat, and the germ and the seed coat of the grain. If I refine it in refined bread, but then I can put those nutrients back in, the niacin and so forth, back in. So some nutrients can be met through fortification or enrichment of packaged and processed foods. But in addition, some nutrients can be met through supplementation, just giving nutrient supplements, a pill, as well. So vitamin A, for example, but also iron and zinc. But the main one in the world is the high cost of vitamin A rich fruits and vegetables can to some degree be compensated for by distributing vitamin A tablets. The reason is that vitamin A is fat soluble, so that people can take vitamin A just twice a year and get replete, have adequate consumption. Of course, it's better to have it every day, definitely better to have it every day in fruits and vegetables because of other things in the fruits and vegetables, as well as the vitamin A itself. But that is something that can be achieved through supplementation to some degree. And iron and zinc to some degree as well. A few others through supplementation. So Rachel asks, can we comment on the institutional infrastructure needed to sustain the kind of monitoring we need, both in response to short-term shocks like COVID-19 and longer-term shocks, both at national and international level? I think that's a great question. What kind of infrastructure would be needed institutionally to sustain monitoring? The ICP has a model of this, working through the regional development banks to reach each national statistical agency. So the way the ICP works is all the African statistical agencies meet through the African Development Bank. And in that way, the National Statistical Services coordinate their actions at a regional level before grouping up to the national level. The World Food Program, they work with each country individually, one-on-one. The FAO also has some links to national statistical agencies, but it's definitely a challenge because of the many of these countries are, of course, very, very low income with very limited capacity to collect price data at each of these markets. Ethiopia has quite strong government capacity, but you can imagine in countries with very limited governments, it's hard to get to all these markets with staff members in a systematic way every month. And question from Laura asking, thinking about the next phase of Kandasa and the possibility of continuing this work in the future, will our data allow us to draw lessons from the 2008 crisis for our current price shocks, perhaps, and other crises for nutrient adequacy? And yes, definitely, we see these, what we're looking at now, the Ethiopia price story. You can see how far away they were from world markets in 2008. But price spikes work differently for different products. And we can track some of that to the extent that we are able to do the country deep dives that have the month-to-month variation. So, one of the problems with thinking about lessons from the 2008 crisis, for example, or even COVID-19, is just how different these, once you look at all the different food groups, you just see there's no one story. Once you look at all the different food groups, the simple story you get from the starchy staples that are highly tradable integrated markets, suddenly these stories are much more nuanced and complicated. And it's hard to draw like a single lesson. So that's one of the things. We're very early days of looking at all the price behavior in all the food groups, and we're seeing just how different the different food groups are. And drawing lessons is hard because there's so many different lessons. But this is like drinking from a fire hose here. Now that we've got the capability to process all these data through these least cost diets.
I have a quick question.
Please, yes.
It's Matt here. I had a question on broader externalities relating to Terry's on climate change a bit, but I was thinking more in terms of local production and competing production for scarce land. So for example, I work on the Sahel, and there have been increasing number of conflicts between pastoralists and farmers. And so effectively there you have a trade-off, a live trade-off between what nutritional intake is being produced. So I had a question on just broader externalities. So obviously there's the nutritional value of animal-related products, but then that reduces the production of the essential staples, the starchy staples that you mentioned. So yeah, just that trade-off. And then I was just thinking, related to that, the environmental impacts, for example, like grazing livestock, then decreasing the fertility of the land, etc. And whether you've thought at all about, I don't know if you're familiar with TEEB, the Economics of Environment and Biodiversity, who talk about the true cost of production, so the actual cost if you pencil in the negative externalities, for example, and how it would be quite interesting to see how that would impact what the actual prices should be rather than what they are for reaching the Eat Land sit. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. That would be a really valuable other thing to be doing, is to be thinking about true cost accounting and externalities, and using price indexes that account for externalities, would be a new frontier here. One really challenging thing, of course, is quantifying those externalities. It's been hard enough for us to quantify the nutrient composition of these foods. If you look across, say, agropastoral grazing, and the cost of maintaining cattle and goats and in some places sheep, those externalities are so different in different settings. Sometimes they're monstrous consequences of resource degradation, and other times a pastoral system could be quite sustainable. So I would think it would require a lot of granular data about environmental consequences to try to get those costs right. But that would be a great frontier. And I don't know anyone who actually works with the team, the project that you mentioned, but I have heard of it. Thank you.
There was a really interesting question earlier by Ina, which I don't think you've looked at, which was around the difference between the affordability and availability of imported goods versus local produce. Is that something that you've looked at much, Will?
Oh, yeah. So here we're seeing a single price. So everything we look at, for example, in this picture, or in the other, that's a single retail item whose price is, so that item itself may have been imported or it may have been produced locally, but its price would definitely be influenced by competition between the imported and the local. So you might see in a given marketplace, for example, among fruits and vegetables, say other fruits and vegetables, there might be an apple from South Africa, but also a banana from within Ethiopia, say, and those prices would be to some degree connected to each other. So there's competition between the imported and the local. Through the MAFAP project, we've been able to look at the effective trade policy to some degree, the effective trade policy on these prices. And as I mentioned, many African countries and Asian countries are beginning to protect producers of these, because these dairy and eggs both have quite substantial scale economies. So they're not mom and pop farms, in the sense of the smallholders who typically produce a lot of other foods. It's typically efficient to have reasonable number of cows in one place and quite a lot of chickens in one place, because there's scale economies in that kind of production. So you tend to have quite connected, more affluent farmers producing these things. And so they lobby for protection. They often get protection from national governments. As I mentioned, there was a case of tomato producers and tomato canning, tomato preserve puree manufacturers in Senegal gaining protection from imports, and so that was raising the prices. That raises the prices of these products quite significantly.
I'm just looking back through whether there's any other questions that haven't been asked, but is there anyone else on the phone that wanted to come in? Because we've got a few more minutes.
Hi, it's Rachel here. I think I just wanted to add on a question from Tremaine that we missed, I think, which was asking about how advisors in countries can kind of leverage this kind of analysis to feed into policy actions and interventions. And just sort of adding on to that, well, it might be useful if you could just talk about the countries that you've mentioned, Ghana and Ethiopia, and I know that they've been kind of front runners for you in terms of engaging at country level, but maybe if you could talk about the other countries that you're working closely with government in or plan to work with, as well as coming back to that issue of what it might mean and how advisors based in country could kind of leverage some of this.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So Yanda and Kandasa were research projects. Their aim was squarely to develop the software tools and the methods, demonstrate validity and usefulness of these tools. So we just serendipitously, because our collaborator in Ghana, let me just jump to that, was very interested in working with his own government agencies. So Daniel Sarpong, is our academic collaborator, and he's the one who initiated all these relationships with government as a sort of serendipitous accident of interest in our research project. So we have not yet begun to do the kind of outreach and engagement that would be needed to begin to ask, how can governments act on this information to say, if we want to bring down the price of dairy and bring down the price of eggs and bring down the price of vegetables, what should we do? We have, a bunch of ideas about that from other kinds of research, but we've, the coordination between the different markets and value chains and what are the components of the retail price in terms of the markup at point of sale versus the transport within a country versus the primary productivity within the country versus trade policy, all of those harmonization of each of those policy instruments is controlled by a different part of government, a different agency, different ministries. And so it's really challenging to think about transport, trade policy, marketplace policy. Often local markets are run by or governed by a Ministry of Rural Development, right, in terms of who has access to a local rural marketplace. So when we work with, in this photograph, the statistical services, just to get the data right, they need to engage with their national governments, and with many ministries and agencies and departments in order to begin to think about the drivers of the cost of a whole diet. So it's a very challenging thing. And in a follow-on project, we hope to be able to work with a number of governments, bring them together, all the agencies responsible for local markets, for trade policy, for infrastructure, rural electrification for marketplaces, and all that. Try to see if we can begin to have price dashboards that help coordinate food system actions around all these different food groups. And before we close, one last question. Somebody typed in, Doreen typed in the chat box, what would you recommend we do to monitor prices of nutritious foods during COVID-19? Draw an ICP or FAO, or would they only provide data later? Yeah, Doreen, that's a very important question. I hope we can begin to do some of that quickly. So you asked about drawing an ICP. So ICP is very retrospective. Their focus is really high quality data, always the same product in multiple countries. And so it's only retrospective back to 2017. FAO does gather monthly overall food price indexes weighted by consumer expenditure. So the food price CPI is shared every month through the FAO. But I believe that getting to that granularity of different food groups is really crucial. So if we can get a few countries or many countries potentially to provide the individual food group price index or an individual sentinel food, and we are talking already with World Food Program about using their connections to national statistical agencies. They've been reporting just staple grains, but we could look at price spikes for dairy, price spikes for eggs, price spikes for vegetables, but also price collapses. Because if demand drops because of low income or because people are switching to food at home, so they're not buying perishables, so there'll be price collapses in wholesale and retail markets for some things. There'll be price trends that shift. So all that we need to look food group by food group, as opposed to the overall food price indexes, which is what's being released now on a monthly basis. But this is very challenging, very, very challenging, because, of course, all these agencies are under terrible, terrible stress. Mm-hmm. So it is 8:30. Thanks very much for 8:30 my time.
Look, Will, thank you so much for presenting to us and answering all of our questions. It's been really fascinating, and it's really exciting to know that you're going to keep collecting data in this rich way and sharing it. So best of luck in the project going forward, and thanks for engaging with us today.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to all for joining.
Thanks,
Take care then. Take care then. Best of luck. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, Phil. That was great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Unknown participant is now exiting.